It was Halloween night, and like every year, the kids in our small town went trick-or-treating in clusters, moving from one house to another, laughing and shouting in their costumes. But everyone knew to avoid the last house on Birch Street. It had been abandoned for years, sitting at the edge of town like a forgotten relic. No one dared go near it, especially after what had happened a few Halloweens ago. That year I was 16, and my friends and I were out to prove that the house wasn't haunted, that it was just an old creaky building like any other. The legend was that an old man named Mr. Holloway had lived there, a recluse who never spoke to anyone. He was said to have gone mad, disappearing one night without a trace, leaving behind an empty, silent house. Some say they still saw lights flickering in the windows late at night, though the place had been abandoned for decades. We dared each other to go up to the house. It was meant to be a joke. Just walk up to the porch, knock on the door, and leave. Simple, right? It was me, Jake, Emily, and Claire. We had spent the night goofing off, going from house to house, our pillowcases heavy with candy. Birch Street was quiet, and when we reached the last house, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt colder there, and the street lamps seemed dimmer, like the light couldn't quite reach the house. "Let's get this over with," Jake said, trying to sound brave. He was always the tough one, but I could see the nervous glint in his eyes. We approached the house slowly. The front yard was overgrown, weeds and vines snaking their way up the sides of the house. The windows were dark, lifeless, but I swear I saw something move behind the glass. I brushed it off as my imagination. After all, it was just an old house. "Who's knocking?" Emily asked, her voice shaky. "I'll do it," I said. Not because I was brave, but because I wanted to get it over with. I climbed the creaky wooden steps, each one groaning under my weight. The porch was covered in leaves, and the door loomed in front of me, chipped paint peeling off in long strips. I knocked. The sound echoed through the house, hollow and eerie. We waited. Silence. "See?" "Nothing," Jake said, letting out a nervous laugh. He was about to say something else when we heard it. A creak. It came from inside the house, like footsteps on old wood. My stomach dropped. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered, her eyes wide. Before anyone could answer, the front door creaked open, just a few inches, revealing only darkness inside. "Nope," Jake muttered, backing up. "We're out of here." But before we could turn to leave, the door swung open wider, revealing the dim outline of a figure standing in the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run. The figure stepped forward slowly, the floorboards groaning under its weight. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his skull, eyes sunken and dark. He wore an old moth-eaten suit, and his hands were covered in something dark and wet. We were frozen in place, too scared to move. The man's lips curled into a smile, an unnatural, twisted grin that made my blood run cold. "Trick or treat," he rasped, his voice low and gravelly, like he hadn't spoken in years. That was all it took. We bolted, sprinting down the steps and back toward the street, not daring to look back. My heart was racing, my legs burning as we ran as fast as we could, the sound of footsteps pounding behind us. I swear I could still hear that awful, raspy voice echoing in my head. We didn't stop until we were halfway down the block, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. When we finally dared to look back, the house was silent again, dark and lifeless, like nothing had happened. "Was that real?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. None of us had an answer. We didn't talk about it again, and after that night, we avoided Birch Street altogether. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had seen something we weren't supposed to, something that had been waiting for years for someone to knock on that door. A few weeks later, I heard on the news that the house had been torn down. They said it was a safety hazard, too old and dangerous to leave standing. But I know better. I know that whatever was in that house is still out there, waiting for the next knock on the door. It was late October, just days before Halloween, when the town of Riverbend held its annual fall festival. My friends and I were eager to visit the corn maze, something we'd done every year since we were kids. But this year felt different. The air was colder, the wind sharper, and the corn, taller than I'd ever seen, swayed ominously under the night sky. As we walked toward the maze, the carnival lights flickered, casting long shadows across the field. The whispers of other festival goers died down the closer we got to the maze. It stood before us like a wall of darkness, the entrance barely visible under the dim lanterns hung overhead. "Ready for a scare?" my friend Mark joked, nudging me with a grin. I laughed it off, but something about that maze made my stomach turn. We stepped inside, the dry stalks of corn brushing against us as we pushed through the narrow path. At first, everything was fine. We laughed, took wrong turns, and even scared each other a few times. But as we went deeper, the laughter died down. The path grew narrower, the corn thicker, and the once faint wind seemed to howl around us. And then we saw him. Standing at the far end of a long, straight row of corn was a figure. He was tall and gaunt, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a ragged coat that flapped in the wind. His face was hidden in shadow, but we could feel his eyes on us. No one spoke, but we all froze, staring at the stranger who had no business being there. "Probably part of the maze, a scare actor or something," Mark muttered, though his voice trembled. But as we took a step forward, the figure didn't move or speak. He just stood there watching us. The air felt thick with tension, and I could hear the pounding of my own heart in the silence. "Let's just go back," someone whispered behind me. We turned to retrace our steps, but the path had changed. The way we came from was now a dead end, the corn walls shifting impossibly close. We were trapped, forced to move forward toward the figure. Our footsteps were cautious, slow, and the figure didn't move an inch as we got closer. But then, as we approached within just a few feet, he finally reacted. His head jerked unnaturally toward us, revealing a face that wasn't human, pale, featureless except for two hollow eyes that glowed faintly under the moonlight. And then he smiled. That's when everything went dark. I woke up hours later, or maybe it was minutes. The cornfield was empty, the maze eerily still. My friends were gone, vanished without a trace. I staggered out, dazed and disoriented, unable to explain what had happened. No one believed me when I told them what I'd seen. The festival organizers insisted there were no actors in the maze that night, and the police found nothing. But every Halloween, the whispers start again, about the watcher in the cornfield. They say he's been there for decades, waiting for those who stray too far into the maze. And I know, because I still feel his eyes on me, even now watching.